I just want to start off that after listening to Monsignor Oliver's talk, mine's going to be coming from a fairly different angle. I really appreciate what he's already told us, and but I do want to, like I said, this is coming from a victim's or a vulnerable person's perspective. So let's see, let's go with it. Okay, just to start off with, I will be presenting research findings and subsequent thoughts and conclusions concerning adult vulnerability to both clergy abuse and when reporting abuse to the church. So I ask, what is the actual problem we are dealing with? And then, what do church definitions sound like to survivors of abuse? Are they enough? What I thought would also be useful is providing a basic outline of the context and dynamics of authority, power, and vulnerability. Doing so will hopefully explain how adults are actually vulnerable. This is where I begin to present survivors' testimonies to see what they can teach us. I then want to take a slight detour to explore one question that bothered me no end in my research, and that is, what is it about sex itself that causes so much trouble? And then in the final sections, I want to present a relatively unrealised vulnerability still needing a great deal more analysis, that which exists when reporting adult abuse. Finally, I'm going to take some very controversial questions. Some may not like the answers, but they may help explain a great deal, including the far from adequate treatment of adult abuse victims that I have witnessed. To end, to make this more than words, I hope to make one contribution with my definition of sexual misconduct by religious professionals and an ordination oath, perhaps, then conclude by offering some crucial take-home points. I hope my presentation will be helpful to survivors and their supporters, as well as to those who make the laws, compose definitions, and especially those who write the related protection policies. Okay. So, in 400 BC, the following words were written: "Into whatever house I enter, I will go into them for the benefit of the sick, and will abstain from every voluntary act of mischief and corruption, and refrain from acts of an amorous nature, or the seduction or abuse of females or males, whether freemen or slaves." Even 2,420 years ago, the ancient Hippocratic Oath showed a deep yet simply phrased understanding of the dynamics of fiduciary duty and professional sexual misconduct. Hippocrates was clearly aware of the ability and possibility of a professional person unethically abusing their power. For Hippocrates, the onus for misconduct was fully on the professional, and the only qualifications as to who needed protection were females or males and freemen or slaves, indeed anyone from whatever house. Moving forward to 2021, the Catholic Church released its much anticipated book, new book 6 of canon law. That release was heralded with the following headlines. Okay, so the Pope changes canon law to explicitly criminalise grooming and priests' sexual abuse of adults. And I'll just click the other ones. So it is clear that these news stories were congratulating the Catholic Church for its major changes to canon law, which would now include any adults as potentially vulnerable to clergy abuse. I was so elated. Now it was going to be possible for non-disabled adults to make claims of abuse by clergy, or so it seemed. I started to read the new book 6 by searching for the terms adult and vulnerable, but was very surprised when neither could be found. I started to fear again that there might be more devils than angels in the details of this heralded document. Meanwhile, any headlines claiming adult abuse being criminalised quickly disappeared, and confusion and disappointment returned. What I wanted to know was whether more of the participants in my research especially would be able to qualify as a vulnerable person under the Vatican's new terms. Previously, there was only one person, or maybe two, out of the 36, However, even after apparently 10 years of intense work on the new book, it was still unclear whether any can at this point in time. Okay. In my searching, I also looked up the new definition of vulnerable adults. Of vulnerable persons found in Pope Francis's Vos Estis Lux Mundi to see if it might shed some lux or light. This document defines vulnerable persons as any person in a state of infirmity, physical or mental deficiency, or deprivation of personal liberty, which in fact even occasionally limits their ability to understand or to want to otherwise resist the offence. While some have hailed the new edition of even occasionally as a major breakthrough, this edition quickly loses impact because it still all relates back to the 2019 Vatican document on the protection of minors and vulnerable people, which uses the same definition but adds, for the purposes of the present law, a vulnerable person is to be considered equivalent to a minor or a child. So, still no bright light regarding who can claim vulnerability and thereby abuse as an adult. And I just have to ask why. Vos Estis then presents its list of canonical crimes. The two main ones of concern here are forcing someone by violence or threat or through abuse of authority to perform or submit to sexual acts. Nothing really new there. Many secular jurisdictions already have such laws, as Monsignor Oliver did mention. And performing sex acts with a minor or, again, a vulnerable person as defined above. Which is if the person consents to the sexual activity because of the abuse of position of authority and trust. So regarding the terms force, violence and threat, while these forms of clergy adult abuse definitely occur, almost all of the participants in my research were subtly groomed and mind manipulated to the point where they were rendered unable to resist the offence. Accordingly, I argue that grooming of adults, spiritual manipulation and forms of subtle coercive control need to have a distinct category of their own in church definitions and canon laws. The above new definition have some additions have some merit, but they are still so vague, at least according to my perception, and I am left wondering why do such vagaries for such important documents and for such a serious issue still exist. Then I find myself asking a different question. Is the church actually trying to avoid clarity? And if so, why? But I'll return to these questions later. While the new canon law 1395 clause 3 does allow for the possibility of abuse of authority, many do not fully grasp the dynamics of such abuse or the context thereof. Before exploring these contexts, I thought it would be helpful to first show how the survivor participants in my research initially viewed their clergy abusers before the abuse happened, and they could choose more than one. So this is just, you could see that for most of them, they perceived them as a spiritual director, at which they were. Many included personal friends, but confidant, chaplain, all those other different roles. While a few of these perceptions are socially based, most are clearly forms of clergy ministry. But it is also clear that all such interactions have within them an obvious inequality of power. This inequality is in itself not wrong, and it's even expected. People need their professionals. To explain further, Professor William Marshall of the University of North Carolina's School of Law presents the context thus. He says, relationships between clients and professionals are for the most based on need seeking expertise in some form. As such, one person is highly vulnerable while the other is strongly powerful, and becomes even more so because of their increased knowledge of the other. The professional will now always have that increased knowledge of the other beyond the pastoral context as well. This can be an issue when clergy freely socialise with their clients, as they do. Lawyers Tobin and Helge in 2013, discussing US legislation in regard to clergy professional abuse of adults, further explain, a clergy person who, by virtue of occupying a position of authority as perceived by the congregant or parishioner, and who, because of that position, has knowledge or notice of the emotional dependence or vulnerability of an adult congregant or parishioner, can take advantage of that position of authority and engage in sexual acts with the congregant or parishioner. In other words, with power and authority and such knowledge come the possibility of that power, authority, and knowledge being abused. However, clergy are not sole operators. Their expertise-based authority as individuals is scaffolded by the authority and power of their institutions. So given this ever-existing power imbalance-based potential for exploitation by individual clergy, how well, how thoroughly, how transparently has this reality been integrated into their scaffolding institutions' protection policies? I would argue not well at all yet. And why? I believe the church needs to change what it is foregrounding. Instead of having the vulnerability status of the victims at the front, it needs to emphasize the power and aberrant behavior of the cleric and the institution that is scaffolding him. Foregrounding vulnerability does ensure that the status quo of church power, control of the narrative, and protection of the clergy are maintained. However, if we take the time to hear the voices of the abused adults, we can begin to appreciate this problem from another standpoint, one firmly grounded on the epistemically advantaged perspective of those who are in the bloody dust, as I call it. The ones who have been groomed, abused, trapped by religious professionals, and who then again had their hopes and trusts crushed when seeking their church's validation and redress. And these are the survivors of the ground, what I call the ground level luces mundi. Okay, firstly, here is a table showing some of the abuses committed by clergy against the participants from my master's study. It'll be presented in 2 slides. Okay, so while these could well be normal sexual activities in many, many ways, it needs to be remembered that the adults involved did not want them. Okay. The sexual misconduct covered most common forms of sexual expression. It's interesting to note that worldwide, while there are around 10,000 children of priests alone, not to mention brothers, which obviously involved full intercourse, that particular expression of abuse did not occur very often. As such, we can extrapolate from that figure of 10,000 that hundreds of thousands more forms of adult abuse actually occur. So, were the participants in various states of vulnerability at the time the abuse started? Absolutely. Were they abused? Definitely. It was very clear to me that these adult women and men were sexually abused, some suddenly and opportunistically, but most after a period of deceptive grooming and consent manipulation. Grooming is relatively easy for those who are vulnerable for reasons of age, levels of naivety, and personal problems. As well, 50% of them stated in the following figure or in their comments that they had also experienced previous abuse in some form. The following figure in 2 parts again shows what the participants in my first study were enduring at the time that they were abused. Okay, in this one, there was only 3 who said there was no significant factors, and interestingly enough, they were the ones who were opportunistically abused. Most of them was obviously suffering in some kind of spiritual confusion or faith crisis, emotional issues, suffering depression and loneliness. As we said, many also suffered previous sexual abuse, but there's quite a few issues going on here. So none of these were necessarily disabled in any way, except for two of them. Not shown here is another fact that youth itself is itself a vulnerability. Around 35% of my participants fell into the 18 to 23 age increment, and 45% between 18 and 29. The oldest abused person, by the way, was a woman who was 69, who was suffering a lot of sexual harassment from her parish priest. So, but these were just the survey responses. When reading their more detailed elaborations, a more real and disturbing picture becomes evident. Edith, a devout traditional Catholic, married with children, and 26 years old, had sought out the help of a highly respected spiritual director, the head of his order, by the way, due to problems with a sense of emptiness in her life and a desire to deepen her spirituality. She explains how the initial protestations of love by the cleric and the holiness of their interaction as defined by him simply turned into the cleric getting what he wanted, which was sex, while she, waiting for spiritual direction, was being more and more entrapped in a cycle of abuse, confusion, and shame instead. As she says, and by the way, the names are pseudonyms, not real ones, my dependence on the relationship increased. I wanted him to love me so much. I wanted him to keep being the way he was to me when we first met. I found that when I tried to come to him for love and direction, he would have me pleasuring him. I was not comfortable about this at all. I pretended to him that I was. He said that he was giving himself to me, and I felt that I was to be grateful. The whole relationship was spiritualized. Winnie, a black South African woman, was a lonely and confused 34-year-old newly divorced mother who was also undergoing a spiritual crisis due to her divorce. She decided to talk to a priest to help her. Their interactions soon became sexualized. At the time of the survey, 2014, she was only newly in this sexual relationship with this priest, defining that relationship herself as an affair. However, she also recognized that she was being emotionally abused. I say he was emotionally abusing me because everything is on his own terms. I only see him when he wants to. If he doesn't want to see me, he avoids me for months. And then when he wants to see me, he comes back as he pleases. He doesn't care if I'm crying or asking him to stop. Then afterwards, he says he loves me. And then I get so very confused because I love him and I don't want him to lose him. I hope and wish that he will marry me. It is very difficult to conclude that Winnie's case here was an affair. She was not just being emotionally abused, but sexually. She is not consenting, but crying and asking him to stop. For most, this would be a definition of rape. The priest was having his cake and eating it too. Winnie was getting but a few crumbs. Many studies show that one vulnerability in particular, that of previous abuse, makes people easy targets for clerical deviance. Tanya, who was only 19 when the clergy abuse began, had experienced sexual abuse at age 9 by a stranger, at age 16 by a guy 5 years older, as she says, and then she was raped again at 18. Understandably, then, she felt deeply conflicted when now a priest she went to for help started sexualizing their interaction. In her words, I was extremely confused. The priest was telling me this was love and said I was beautiful. I felt wonderful while he was there because his definition of what was happening was dominant. But afterwards, I felt awful, sinful, depressed, seriously bad, and often suicidal. Previous sexual abuse, especially as a child, generates serious trust and boundary issues. According to researchers French et al., being sexually abused as a child creates deep confusion, which can easily render the person less likely to ward off unwanted advances and being easier targets for manipulation into sexual assault. As Tanya powerfully explains and at times yells, I was depressed and frequently suicide. In retrospect, none of it would have happened except that he initiated a sexual relationship. I can say for absolute certain that if it was up to me at all, I would have followed my sense that he was a celibate and out of bounds. I fell for his bullshit because I was convinced he was truly holy. However, as Margaret Kennedy, excellent dissertation, states, a history of sexual victimization only increases risk or vulnerability to further abuse if there is a perpetrator who is prepared to take advantage of this. For another participant, Andy, who was 20 when the abuse began, his vulnerability issues were other forms of child abuse, very low self-esteem and loneliness. All Andy wanted was friendship with his parish priest. He describes his context thus: I was lonely and suffered from very low self-esteem at the time. I sought out the cleric during the time of great need, the fallout of experiences of father-instigated emotional abuse and physical abuse and domestic violence in the home and other personal problems. The priest became Andy's personal friend, spiritual director, confessor, and confidant, who encouraged the friendship to grow and become more intimate. Andy explains how small gifts were given to me to forge a relationship where I owed him something. Eventually, however, the relationship became one of abuse, which Andy says took the form of the cleric constantly trying to turn me off women, trying to seduce me and entice me to his bedroom, and sensual touching of my body. Andy was also required to give the cleric a body massage on a regular basis in order to receive forgiveness for my sins, as he says, following confession. Andy says that the main reason the relationship got to the point it did was because the cleric had sexually groomed him while he was in a state of loneliness and in need of friendship and counselling direction. His analysis was correct. These are just a small example of the vulnerabilities in the lives of the men and women groomed and abused by clergy who would not or could not maintain their professional, moral, religious, or legal boundaries, not to mention their sexual urges. Okay, moving on. Through all my research, there was always one nagging question that pestered me no end. What is it particularly about sex, in clergy abuse especially, that upsets people so much, especially given our so-called sexually liberated world? I believe I found one answer in a 1987 article by Christian ethicist Karen Labarx, entitled Appropriate Vulnerability, a Sexual Ethic for Singles. I found this article when doing a broader search of the term vulnerability. It presented a new and more positive angle on this term. But please note, this is a discussion based on sexual ethics, not necessarily legalisms, even though it could at times be a good basis thereof. So, finally, firstly, in essence, Labarx's article explained beautifully, logically, idealistically perhaps, and that vulnerability is not a dirty word, it is not a weakness, it is not even a negative. It is even a necessary element in being human, needed for growth as an individual and essential in the cementing of deep and lasting relationships. It is particularly acute and needed if the unitive sexual experience is going to be whole and genuine. Labarx then goes on to elaborate that if we want to become close to another human being, both lovers must allow themselves to be appropriately vulnerable with each other during sex. Doing so creates an ever-increasing communion with the other. As well, such vulnerable love can only really be expressed under the protection of a deep trust encapsulated in ongoing commitment of the lovers to each other. So you can see where I'm going with this. Therefore, any exercise of sexuality that violates or refuses appropriate vulnerability is wrong. This includes not just violations of the partner's vulnerability, but also the refusal of one's self to be vulnerable. For example, rape is wrong, not only because it violates the vulnerability of the one raped, but also because the rapist guards his own power and refuses to be vulnerable. Similarly, seductive grooming is wrong because the seducer guards her or his own vulnerability and uses sex as a weapon to gain power over another. Any sexual encounter that hurts another so that he or she has to guard against vulnerability in the future violates the appropriate vulnerability, which is part of the true meaning and purpose of our God-given sexuality. Sex then, as well as having procreational and unitive purposes, is the place where we relinquish the will to dominate, but also open ourselves to deep union with another. We do this by becoming appropriately vulnerable within a solid commitment to the other and they to you. Now, to the extent that appropriate vulnerability is missing or refused, sexual expressions will be relatedly harmful or upsetting or shallow or irresponsible or, at its worst, abusive. Examples of this more selfish sex might be between a priest, brother or nun who has no intention of committing themselves to you, finds you in a fragile state, but then requires you to vulnerabilize yourself through sex while refusing to do so themselves. In other words, they sexually abuse you. In such context, not only is there a deep power imbalance, but a deep vulnerability imbalance as well, with neither ever working in your favor or for your benefit. Again, this is sexual abuse. And then this abuse happens in a religiously context, especially trust is snapped in an existential earthquake. You drown in confused and wrongly directed guilt and shame. Your inner world map of reason and faith is suddenly shaken to its very roots. And what for? So that they, the church's representative of the most loving, caring entity, Jesus Christ, could have non-committal, non-vulnerable, selfish sexual release using you as their object, only to then walk away and return to their secure and powerful religious clerical life. But when I hear refugee Sue telling her story of snatched sex in the bushes in a park by a randy Dominican priest, when I hear of a respected Carmelite spiritual director asking Edith, whom he had groomed and lied to about the holy spirituality of their special relationship, to give him oral sex but to get out of her head and think of God while doing so, when I hear of a Franciscan priest already known to have misconducted with other women, being asked to provide spiritual direction for Claire, who was wanting to become a nun, only for him to sexualize her and totally ruin her vocation and her mental health, when I hear Vince tell me how, when he was seeking to enter the priesthood, the diocesan priest who was meant to care for him as a young refugee and as a novice, says he needed to help Vince overcome sexual temptation against women by having sex with him. When I hear the story of a Blessed Sacrament father having hurried sex in a car with physically disabled Lynn, who he has totally bamboozled over time and trapped with promises of marriage, but then when told to give up his private life because he was being considered for the next provincial, tells her that he was only experimenting. When I hear of a vulnerable, naive country lad, Brian, being told he had to prove his masculinity and sexuality to his novice master in order to join, resulting in long life repercussions, then I ask quite angrily, why are these people still being heartlessly dismissed? And trust me, they have been and they still are. These are not consensual affairs. How do any of these horrible acts resemble love blessed by God? And how do these selfish acts even minusculely resemble what appropriate vulnerability is in the human sexual act should be? Why are these women and men not being fully validated, embraced, healed, and redressed? Is one reason because of ambiguous laws and definitions from the church? I am now certain that it actually is. But there's more. To make matters worse, there is another form of vulnerability within these victims, rarely if ever realized by others. These men and women are also too often exploited, not by abusive clergy this time, but within another steep power imbalance. The new and ever greater imbalance this time comes from the church officials, representatives, often bishops, during church processes of reporting their abuses. Furthermore, these usually still somewhat fragile individuals are dealing with the very communities in which their abusers are often still nestled. For example, Adela, like all the participants in my research, approached the church in hope and trust that she would be heard, validated, and cared for. However, as she explained to me, still showing deep hurt, after many years, the opposite happened. When she and her husband approached her abuser's religious order, with whom they had had years of deep interaction, they of course believed that they were approaching friends. However, to her deep pain, she described how they turned us into enemies straight away. She was devastated and felt harmed and abused all over again. This was her faith community dismissing her this time. Sadly, Adela's experience was not at all unique. I know that some such women and men are attending this very session, and they are still hurting. Okay. Vos Estis does show some awareness of the second vulnerability state, when in their Article 5, care for the person, clearly requires that those who state that they have been harmed together with their families are to be treated with dignity and respect, and in particular are to be welcomed, listened to, and supported, including through provision of specific services. However, what most in my research and beyond have experienced were attempts to again abuse their vulnerability by seeking to neutralize the validity of their experiences and accordingly themselves as genuine people. I don't know if Vos Estis is retrospective or it applies to adult victims. It would be wonderful if it was so. Either way, not much more is said about the victims of the offences. Vos Estis is more about reporting procedures, bishops, and the rights of the alleged offenders. Back to the victims. Regarding the tactics used, all of my participants experienced at least one, but usually many, of the neutralisation tactics shown in the following table, developed to collate and describe their experiences. It sort of goes from the least offensive to the most, but these can happen anytime and they interact. Time again does not permit elaboration of these tactics and modes, but I will focus on the final one, the coercive tactic, where as it's at its most extreme, the church often employs lawyers in a last stand attempt to even aggressively neutralise survivors. Such tactics are, for powerful institutions, very easy to accomplish given their incredible financial, legal, and generally elite power. Here is a table showing the number of times participant survivors felt they experienced coercive tactics. All of them felt that they had experienced some form of coercive tactic. While clearly present in many other tactics and modes, albeit perhaps more subtly, coercive tactics usually begin in the bargaining stage and came into overt full operation if survivors decided to litigate, or even when only suggesting that they would do so because of how they've been treated. Indeed, such intimidation and character assassinations are happening right now, in one case in the US in particular. In my study, one participant took out civil action for her years of abuse because she had lost everything, including her ability to work. One whistleblower decided to also do so when she was let go of because she was supporting adult victims of a brother, the head of her Catholic employment place. Another man only said he was going to take out civil action after the officials had completely mishandled his case. He also found out that the bishops and others involved believed he was lying and simply out to get money. They knew he had been abused for years, beginning when he was 17, but when he sought redress, suddenly they claimed that when he turned 18, the sex must have been consensual then, and that he must have been gay, which he wasn't, and because, well, gay men are more promiscuous and like sex. What seemed to cause further inflammation in all cases was the required existence during all formal church reporting processes of lawyers and often church insurers, who were not there to provide comfort for the pain and suffering of the victim, but rather to bargain a legal settlement Their gestures and gifts, as they were generally called, usually started with the lowest amount the church was willing to offer. For many, this was just too upsetting to go through. For example, Brian, the young countryman who was told he had to prove his sexuality in order to join the religious order, described the official process he experienced. Lawyer B made an offer which was unacceptable to me. He stonewalled me into taking his offer of a few $1,000s. I suggested to him that the church would have to pay for my legal fees as well. He slammed the mediation table with his fist, exclaiming, "The church doesn't have to do anything." Brian now realised what he was up against. Lawyer B represented Diocese B, and in particular, Bishop D. Brian said that Lawyer B's behaviour further traumatised me. It was more abuse from the church. He had a dollar figure to deal with and to offer as a gesture to me. I had an option, take it or leave it. By 4 p.m. that day, I took the gesture offered. I just want to emphasise here that these were final occurrences after a lot of previous interactions with the officials, which were just going so badly. One needs to keep in mind that by this stage, the religious order had actually been disbanded by Pope John Paul because of rampant sexual abuse, including of children. And yet Brian, perhaps because he was still a rather vulnerable man, still had to fight for justice and redress. There's just something very wrong here. As already mentioned, the one particular belief that revealed itself as foundational to church attitudes and behaviours when dealing with adult victims was that even when they acknowledged that the sex occurred, they never really or sincerely believed that abuse had occurred. For example, participant Wendy stated that the priest psychologist dealing with her case, which was undeniably abuse if you read it, said, "If the relationship had continued positively, I wouldn't be crying about it now." Or another priest who scolded another of my participants, Sue, by saying, "What? You have an affair and now you want us to pay?" Both these statements reveal an attitude which betrayed the supposed sincerity of the officials and the processes. They were said in anger after initial care. Why? Because the victims had stopped being totally submissive or perfect victims. Others like Lynn, Adela and Claire all had similar experiences. Lynn, a disabled and groomed at 16 by the possible new provincial. He was not prepared to negotiate because, unlike child abuse, he said this was an adult thing and that it had to be consensual because I was over 18, and that's what the law says. And I believe that's why they fought it so hard. Adela, a young uni student groomed by a well-loved spiritual speaker. In the 4th session, the female official actually suggested I might be feeling guilty because it was appropriate that I feel guilty. I was an adult after all, and Father D hadn't used force. And then Claire, a young woman, wanting to be the nun. But then again, Father P's whole thing was, you know, it's your fault, or you know that you've sinned. In a sense, you've been complicit. These essentially false constructs, especially when coupled with the very narrow church perceptions and definitions surrounding vulnerability, just have to be unpacked, if not reversed and redefined. When couched in a professional context, professional people exist to provide a service as defined by the professional body to whom they belong. Who of us would expect that sexual activity would be part of that service? Sex between professional and their clients is indeed forbidden across all professions. So why would clergy of all people be exempt? But many believe they are and should be for some reason. So regarding clergy sexual abuse of adults and the reporting thereof, we need so much more than continued definitional vagaries. We need a much more practical, meaningful, and clear framework to dispel the current confusion that obviously exists, so much so that we even need a conference such as this. So here is where I would like to return to the question I proposed earlier. Is the church actually just trying to avoid clarity around the issues of sexual abuse of clergy by of vulnerable adults? And if so, why? If not, then why does it exist, that vagaries? Is it perhaps that the church is anxious about revealing that, according to SIPE at least, only 50% of clergy actually believe that chastity is necessary for celibate life? This would be a problem because clergy chastity is presented by the church as the norm. It has also always been upheld as a sign, a holy sacrament, an expression of holiness, connected to the sense that clergy have a divine authority over all of the rest of us. Might clarity and transparency also reveal that sexual abuse of minors is the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the violation of professional boundaries by clergy. 4 times as many priests involve themselves sexually with adult women and twice the number with adult men as priests or others who involve themselves sexually with children. Even worse, because of high clergy sexual activity, both opposite and same-sex, as well as intercleric sex, a secret culture has become necessary to protect against exposure of that now normalised sexual activity. SIPE, in point 6 of his 11-point thesis, outlines why this culture is needed. Even temporary involvement of a priest, and you could add brother or nun, in a sexual relationship or experimentation with another priest puts him in a fearful state and a bind of systemic blackmail. He cannot expose the other priest without exposing himself and endangering not only his reputation, but also even his career. This seems a highly logical reason for so much cover-up, at least. As one notorious abuser in Australia commented when challenged about not fearing his bishops, stated, "I'm not worried about what the bishops might do to me because of what I know about the bishops." So, could fear of exposure of the backlash of clerical life, of the backstage of clerical life, be the reason for the general lack of clarity, not just about which adults can be abused, but also celibate chastity or levels thereof? But maybe there is one fear that is even more fundamental. Given that the chaste celibate clergy are actually the central core of authoritative power and control for the church, any exposure of a broad lack of adherence to celibate chastity, therefore, might undermine the very legitimacy of its power core. These are really huge and serious questions, but they simply have to be asked. If they are not, then there will continue to be abuses of all kinds and a dismissal of covering up thereof. One thing is for sure, we can, or perhaps I should speak for myself only, I can no longer assume that clergy believe in chastity, like I foolishly did when I was 20, and as most victims did when they were abused. So what do we do? Because of clergy sexual abuse and activity, the church is undergoing a major identity crisis, and we've hardly begun to hear about adult abuse. Why has it come to this? And how can all this be dealt with? Well, that's also a hugely difficult question. Why? Because to respond to it, the church would have to face up to the enormous task of thoroughly dealing with all elements within the 3 realms of clergy themselves and their institutional structures as presented here. All 3 in turn continually overlap and mutually influence each other. So on the psychological level, we have individual clergy who may have mental health problems or sexual issues, misogyny, homophobia, personal immaturity, or assorted unresolved traumas, and then express these deficiencies through individual deviancy and power abuse. Then, because no cleric is an island, clergy with individual deviancies once exposed or witnessed are absorbed and normalised within a now necessarily secretive culture furnished by normalisation of clergy sexual activity, secondary deviance, blackmail, recidivism, cover-up, or demotions or promotions based on how well one submits. This is where one also finds the corrupt, powerful protectionist groups, the cabals, and all the mecharics in the church, seeking to control that church and individuals to live lives in their own image and according to their own aberrant gospel. This is the realm of collective deviance and power abuse. Overarching all these, but also influenced by the others, there is the small m magisterial circle, where there can sometimes be found controlling, divinized myths, stereotypes or narratives, unenlightened dogmas, theologies and canon laws, present culture-based ideologies, agendas, and insincere deflective definitions and euphemisms. I cannot go into a detailed analysis of all these elements here, but all are discussed in my PhD. However, presenting this more holistic framework is crucial. These interlocking circles reveal that adults and all clergy abuse cannot be simplistically blamed on individuals or even any one aspect in the church. But what can we do now? To start with, we need a strong, decisive protection policy for all and any adults. Furthermore, that policy needs to be fully centred more on a universal, clear, unambiguous definition of clergy sexual misconduct. In turn, that definition needs to be framed not by religious concepts so much, but within a broader professional context. Doing so removes many of the ambiguities that arise because of religious concepts of sin and immorality that may lie in the sense that some clergy, simply because they are clergy, think that they are somehow exempt from blame or for sexual offences. Doing so also places the definition squarely on the power balances inherent in professional or clerical interactions. So, because of this need, as part of my PhD, I proposed the following definition. Elaborations can be found in my PhD. So, sexual misconduct by religious professionals occurs when those religious professionals, whether male or female, misuse, abuse, take advantage of, or disregard, whether intentionally or through negligence, their positional and personal power, which they hold by virtue of belonging to a powerful institution or professional organisation, to target, overpower, groom or confuse, whether subtly or forcefully, less positionally or personally powerful adults for any form of sexual activity with them, whether legal, consensual or not, with little or no regard for the harm produced or the effects that such harm may have on others. Sex-based abuses by religious professionals are not just a mere sin of the flesh. They are serious abuses of power, of sex, of trust, of vulnerability, of people, and they are even an abuse of Christ himself, insofar as whatsoever you do to the least of my brothers and sisters, that you do unto me. They are also, in many cases, criminal. Furthermore, they cause deep harm, not just for the victims, but to the whole church and even broader society. Accordingly, all official church documents and responses to victims must fully reflect this truth if the church is to be a legitimate moral leader, especially in this now very troubled world. For those seeking an example of a protection policy more akin to this definition, may I suggest you have a look at the Maltese ecclesiastical policy. I've got it in my reference list here. So, here's a thought. To accompany this definition, perhaps as well as swearing obedience to the church and their bishops or superiors, and the bishops to the Pope, ordination final profession should include that all clergy and religious make a clerical version of the Hippocratic Oath, maybe a Christic Oath, if you want to call it that, perhaps. So, I promise to God and to his church and people that in whatever context I am in, pastoral or social, I will be there for their benefit alone and abstain from every act of mischief and corruption and refrain from acts of an amorous nature or the seduction or abuse of females or males, whether vulnerable or not, on pain of being laicized should I do so. If there comes a time when I can no longer maintain this oath, then I will voluntarily leave the clerical life. If this cannot be done, then I believe every Catholic church and office needs to have a poster which says something like, To all those who enter and intend to interact with clergy, do not assume that they believe in chastity as necessary for their priesthood. Ask them first. I certainly would like to have known before seeking counselling from the priest I did when I was 20. He didn't believe in chastity at all, especially, as I found out later, for gay clergy. I don't think he's alone there. Just to conclude, the vulnerability status of people and victims should never be part of any inquisitorial process discerning whether clergy abuse of adults has happened or not. What I hope this presentation has achieved, and that this conference on vulnerability to abuse and the Catholic Church will achieve overall, is the consideration at least that perhaps we have been approaching the whole issue from the wrong angle. Instead of asking what is a vulnerable adult, or even what is vulnerability, Hippocrates didn't. Vulnerability was an accepted or given reality. No, the vital question we should be asking is, what or who is an abusive religious professional? Why are they abusing? And what is the institution that ordains them going to do about them? However, I do believe that understanding vulnerability can help us understand how clergy abuse happens. But definitions of vulnerability or vulnerable adults should never be used to explain why clergy abuse of adults, or anyone for that matter, happens. Abuse doesn't happen because there is a vulnerable person. It happens because there is a professional religious who takes advantage of that vulnerable person. I'll leave you with a quote from a novel called Eminence by Morris West. Paradoxically, it was spoken by a priest who himself broke his vows of chastity after a woman of high influence, who in the traumatic aftermath of himself being raped with a whip handle in an Argentinian town square, was taken into her home to be cared for. But I will let you explore that story for yourself, should you choose to do so. Thank you so much for listening to my voice and that of my fellow survivors.